Well, we have traffic out there all at once. Doesn't take long to get across the lake. How about that? There we go. Oh boy. I hold this still. They're moving a pretty good clip. Meanwhile, oh, here's Marcia. Well, I have to take you, Marcia. I mean, gee, a real bathing beauty out here.
Oh, yeah.
I shot quite a bit of sailboat out there. They really scurried across that lake in a hurry.
Yeah. Yeah, they're back to scurrying. That boat works pretty well for this size lake.
So you're hooked up to...
The sun feels so good.
Yeah. Right? I'm not hooked up.
Are you going to get suntan today or burnt?
No, I won't get either.
Just won't stay there that long.
This is what I like. A pleasant day with the hot sun.
Yeah.
When you think of the possibilities of space travel,
sailing.
they talk about solar wind,
Uh-huh.
having sails that catch the solar wind, the force of light.
Yeah?
Virtually, that's what it is.
Woo! Around we go.
I don't know what she did. She did a 360 though, whatever it was.
She certainly did. She keeps right on going. Okay. Maybe the wind just caught it. Gave it a good heave.
I don't know. I don't know how. She must not have the...
I think she's experimenting.
There's a place to hook the rope in, so it only goes out a certain distance. Maybe they don't have it hooked in, because I never saw the sail go that far away before. I don't know.
Pure professionalism.
can't tell how fast it's moving, but it's very steady coming this way.
There she goes.
Are they going to really try to come into the beach?
Yeah. That's how they went out.
What happens to the dagger board when it goes over that road?
Pull it out.
Pull it out? Oh, I see. It's right in back. It was right in back.
They may need a pull. Sarah?
Why not over to the deck, the dock?
I think that's where Ken's going. Well, if you want to go, get on. Somebody's going to get off. You can get on.
Now who's going to get out and who's going to get in, huh?
I don't know.
Uh-oh. Oh, Ken's going to get out. And then Sarah's going to take Grandpa for a ride.
I guess so.
Oh no, she's getting out. Well, hey, there's a nice breeze. You're missing it. Sarah, you mean you didn't feel safe with Grandpa in there?
Grandpa wasn't in there.
I thought you were going to take Grandpa for a ride.
That's all.
Well, Pa and Grandpa.
So, the head twice enough. Oh. That was what did it in? You like being a passenger? No, that's what the analyzer is. It's been enough fun for me. When you get home, would you just turn the steak that's in the white ceramic dish into the marinade?
Well, there's a good breeze going through now. If it catches them, their sail is kind of flopping.
Yeah. There they go.
See, I'm still here. Christina's out right where you are.
Well, I can't tell on it, but I guess that must be Bill and Mary Bory.
Everyone will think you lost your baby.
The sun goes down, it finally gets dark.
I'm just going to get up the room.
Now they're really scooting through. Some fun.
Before he loses his
Right there's
Yeah.
the first capsize of the day. I hope they get it out of there. Yep, there they come. That looks pretty good.
He doesn't hear me.
Seeing their viewfinder.
Heavy things on the bottom, like
Aim it to the sand with standby.
Oh, it's on now.
Now they're out of sight. They're way down there.
What's it? I must have changed them. That's on.
Was it on?
You got me.
BTR. What's BTR? Just says on.
That's for the video when you hook it up to the TV. I don't know what the letters stand for, but we have it on our TV remote.
It's still on.
Why is it still on?
I don't know. See? Well, because this is on, I guess. See if I put my hand up here, it
Oh.
tries to throw or something.
No red. Oh, there it goes. See? It takes that long for this thing to. No, they're not. Coming into the dock at McKemble Lake.
Gone? Oh yeah, we got a red light. It's on.
But it's on micro.
They're awfully closest.
Now I can focus it okay. Because it's
Good.
not a macro.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, just fine, thank you. Do you realize you're the only one in the family that we don't have
Now you do.
on tape? Now I do. Gee, you're not even a comedian or anything today, are you?
I have no lines. It's not fair to point one of these things at somebody at 8 o'clock in the morning.
8 o'clock? Those bells, it's
Well,
Never mind, never mind.
36.
oh, well,
Might as
Steve,
well be. It's 8 o'clock somewhere in the world.
right here it says 6:34 on this one in the morning.
This is my mother. She's got this funny thing attached to her face. We love her. It's in decline. It's not a happy thing. It's not a beautiful thing.
Move to Chicago.
Chicago.
Take the rest of it.
See you. Take care of those dogs.
Yeah.
Ma. When you go?
13th, Friday.
Oh, it's the day of my bachelor party for Rod. So I don't know if I'll see you before then. If I don't, then, well, see you Thanksgiving.
Yes, I'll be home Thanksgiving, then I come home 14th.
Wow. Ooh.
January.
Excuse me, dear.
Not again.
I want
We'll have a chance to take a look at this vehicle. I mean, what's with the trunk?
Got damaged.
Huh?
Damaged. Somebody shut it with too heavy a load in it. Come on. I hope you're panning and zooming,
Oh, definitely.
cutting to the chipmunks.
Well, I can't see the front of it. But since it's your Peugeot, why...
Bonjour. Yeah, get a picture of Lionel.
Well, I think your sisters back there might like to observe Steve's
Doesn't like the cold.
up-to-date car.
You're gonna have problems.
Anti-freeze in its stock?
I haven't checked that. I'll have to do the whole winter inspection now that it's getting frigid. You shouldn't be out here in your short sleeves, George. You could catch your death. Goodbye.
Ta-ta.
I have it all lined up, Steve. Yes, it looks great. Bye-bye. We start shooting. Whoop, we're shooting at the top first. Okay, now we gradually go down and look at that.
That's some bar.
It's your pump. Yes, your pump on the front. Well, gee, then can I say bye-bye to Dad? No. Yeah. For the first time she's ever been on camera. Now, we are at above 202 at 6. Okay, don't bother. It's all right now. What have you? New York. Come on, bank where we stand. Ooh.
Years on that one policy are aggregated and considered as one loss occurrence for purposes of the insurance agreement. Let's go to fidelity. Fidelity, in the wordings that are common, amounts to any one scheme is one loss occurrence. But you don't have a problem about determining the date of loss in the event there are several bonds involved, which may spread out over a number of years, because almost universally, the date of discovery is considered the date of loss for purposes of the reinsurance agreement. So naturally, if you have only one date of loss, you only have one roster of reinsurers. Claims made and losses discovered. We have definitions for these terms, and you will find that there are companion terms like reporting endorsement, retroactive date, prior acts. We define those as well. Again, I'd like to mention that these terms are not the only terms used in business. In past years, different terms were used by different companies, but these seem to be the more generally accepted terms used in the present day. Now, on that interlocking clause, you could have a situation where a loss occurrence could involve multiple policies, being covered by different reinsurers, which I've already described, where you have claims made where the loss, if the claim is made during one reinsurance period, you can have losses occurring during, where the date of loss is automatically fixed on the actual date of loss covered by another reinsurer. You can have multiple policies, all losses recurring basis, with one or more affording coverage on an aggregate basis, which I already described briefly. And although you do not find the problem in this particular specimen agreement, you could have a runoff situation where business is run off under the old agreement and all new renewal policies are covered under the new agreement. And one of the runoff policies is combined with one of your new policies for in the same loss occurrence. Therefore, you have two reinsurers who are responsible for loss arising out of the same loss occurrence. There are other combinations, but they are rare, and these are the most common. I like to say that the key is proportion and the magic is great, because when you're dealing with a situation with an interlocking clause, you will invariably find that the people who got the premium, they pay the same proportion of loss that they got the premium. Whereas some of the other approaches will arbitrarily place the loss on one roster of reinsurers and leave other reinsurers who got some of the premium scot-free. I really find no problem with this, though, because sooner or later, they're going to get more loss than they deserve on another loss where the premium wasn't spread out the way they'd like it. It all comes out in the wash. The term gross net earned premium income is a pretty standard one. Another variation is, other than the one shown, is where you deduct from your gross premium only pro rata reinsurance premium, even though the loss will still be determined after the deduction of all other reinsurances. The reason for this is that occasionally you will have facultative excess, and because of the layering of the facultative excess and the layering of your reinsurance agreements, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to properly apportion what part of that facultative excess reinsurance premium should be applied in reduction of the premium under this cover, and what should be applied in reduction of the premium under the next cover. And it was found that there are arguments that develop over relatively small amounts of money. So one of our brokers said, the heck with it. We'll simply say that it isn't deducted. And the amount of money is minor. The amount of problems avoided is worth it. They always will reduce by the amount of pro rata insurance, which of course is much more substantial. Gross net written premium is sometimes used. My recommendation is that you stick with gross net earned premium unless you have a compelling reason for gross net written premium. And believe it, there are sometimes compelling reasons. But like everyone, some producers seem to develop a mindset on written premium. And written premium on excess agreements can cause some problems. It can cause problems that are rather subtle, but when they develop, they can involve large sums of money and create problems that are not anticipated, that could have been avoided if you work on the basis of earned premium. Another point is the multi-peril premium division, where the premium is indivisible, such as homeowners, farm owners, previously mentioned to you. You'll find that this is a matter of negotiation between the company and the reinsurer, and that an awful lot depends upon the distribution of their business. The general rule is that on your homeowners, in urban areas, you're going to have a larger percentage devoted to casualty. In your rural areas, you're going to have a smaller percentage, a portion to casualty. The ranges, while I am not saying that these are violent, the ranges run anywhere from, say, 15% in your urban areas down to as low as 8% in your rural areas. We define the word policy mainly because It avoids repetition in a couple of dozen different places in the agreement. Agreement year, well, we've already covered that, but it is just a wonderful thing. One of the ways that agreement year can be used is a rather indirect and possibly subtle method of controlling minimum premium. I've already described to you the problems that can arise if you're not careful in a minimum premium situation where there's a runoff. But another way of handling that, a perfectly legitimate way, is to simply say that if the agreement is run off, the runoff period becomes part of the last agreement year. So the last agreement year now becomes probably 24 months, including your runoff. So it involves what amounts to usually about 1.5 times the normal agreement year. Well, how does this impact the minimum premium? Well, because you have tied the minimum premium to your agreement years. So now there is one minimum premium for that, including agreement years. No penalty in the company. I mentioned it, I want to mention it again. If you do go the route of definitions, which I highly recommend, always read those definitions over and make sure you use those definitions. It is really embarrassing when you have a list of things down there that are defined and not used elsewhere. Let's go to warranties. The nature of warranties are that they are hard and fast. Warranties have a definite place in reinsurance agreements, but don't use them if they are not necessary. They bind the company. They are extremely difficult to negotiate out of because the reinsurer, if it's a true warranty and true expectation, expects to be protected by that warranty and has every reason to be protected. So my advice is minimize the warranties to those points where they are necessary. Furthermore, make exceptions to the warranties where the company has no control. Take an example where reinsurers on the layers excess of $1 million don't wish to be exposed to certain liabilities. And they say that certain policies will have a warranty of not more than $1 million in policy limit. Well, this may not be the best example, but you can think of other examples where if the company were writing, say, workers' compensation does not have a policy limit. The liability under the policy is prescribed by the statute of the individual state involved. The statute tells you how much you're liable to. And there is nothing that the company can do to limit their liability if they write statutory workers' compensation. So what you do in that instance, you say that except in those instances where there is no policy limit or where it is unlimited. Remember now, there are no-fault situations where there are unlimited. So what you are doing, in effect, is you are requiring the company to control their policy limits when they can. But you are not penalizing the company when they can't control them. Another way, and it's a very satisfactory way, is to put in deemers. Now these deemers can be used in a number of instances, but let's fall back on the example of policy limits. Say that the company will not issue policy limits in excess of $1 million, any one policy, any one loss occurrence, or so be. And by golly, in a moment of insanity, the underwriter underwrites policy for $2 million, and you know which policy has a $2 million loss. That's it. That's Murphy's Law. Always going to have that money. What is the company going to do? If you had a warranty that simply said they will not exceed $1 million, the common law approach of warranties is that if you violate a warranty, you have no coverage under the contract. It voids the contract. Now, I don't mean to say that the American view is in all jurisdictions that severe, and I doubt very much that any arbitration panel would be that severe, but nevertheless, it puts the company in real jeopardy. Whereas if you said, for so deemed, then you would accomplish the dual thing of protecting the reinsurer, because this loss, even though $2 million, is only deemed to be $1 million, because the warranty says no more than $1 million or so deemed. So it's $1 million. That's the liability maximum that they bargained for. That's what they have. The company still has the limit of $1 million above $1 million, which they either have to pay net or some other reinsurance, maybe. But nevertheless, they at least have the coverage that they bargained for in the first $1 million under the agreement. Net retained lines article. This is a very basic article. A lot of people read it, they don't really understand what's involved, so they go on to something else that seems to have relevance. And believe me, this has relevance. It also presupposes a knowledge of how you put together your reinsurance programs. And if you don't, you're left wondering which comes first, the chicken or the egg. And in some very imaginative combinations, I'll tell you, everybody who looks at it has that question in their mind. And they finally sort it out. But what it says is, by golly, if you've got reinsurance elsewhere, it's going to be deducted under this agreement. No two ways about it. In fact, if you have reinsurance elsewhere, and the reinsurer goes bust, you still don't get coverage for that under our agreement, because we're not a guarantor of all the other reinsurers with whom we do business. We can't control that. We're not going to be liable for it. Now, if you are involved in putting together a program with layered agreements, realize that unless you make some changes in this article, you're going to defeat the whole concept of layered protection, because all other reinsurances are going to be deducted. Oops, that means the first is deducted when you look at the second, and when you look at the third, the first and the second. You're wrong, the whole concept. So what you do is either here, or possibly in your cover article, or possibly elsewhere, you will say that it is understood that the company has protected and that it will not be deducted in damaging over the loss because this agreement. Another thing you want to do, you may have quota share of the net retained liability. Quota shares of net are virtually without exception for, well, put it this way, the basic reason is because the company has a surplus profit. And it permits great flexibility when you quota share only your net as compared with quota sharing your gross liabilities, which then impact all your excess. The company's surplus position may vary from year to year for any number of reasons. Bad experience, poor investment, good investment, whatever. So they may find themselves requiring quota share of one specified percentage now, and maybe 5% next year, 5% less next year, who knows. The thing is that this, for practical purposes, is just going to be ignored. So you want to put another little squib in there, and you say something to the effect that it is understood that the company is carrying quota share reinsurance and retained liability, and such quota share reinsurance will be, I used to say ignored, but it sounds too nasty, disregarded for purposes of this agreement, just as if it didn't exist. Well, you found out by now that reinsurers like the company to have a stake, and they like to have the company have as much stake as possible. So they take a dim view of the company reducing its stake. And of course, when you're dealing with an excess, it's the retention. That's the company's stake. So they may say, well, we're understanding, but we've got to put some limits on this. If you are required to put limits on it, give them a little bit of leeway. If they presently have 20% quota share of their net, say maybe not exceeding 30%. So if they have to increase it to 25%, or maybe even 30% next year, you don't have to scratch out endorsements changing the net retained lines article to conform with reality for the coming year. It's already provided for in the cushion. It's just, you know, the reinsurance business is a business. And one of the things we have to control is is not going to cost the paper itself, but all the work that has to do with putting those absolutely worthless things down on paper that could be avoided by a little bit of foresight and putting together the package to start with. Exclusions. Property covers have their exclusions. Casualty covers have their exclusions. And usually a lot more than property. There are sometimes page after page of exclusions. I have not attempted to show exclusions here other than the ones that will probably be required in all reinsurance agreements. Nuclear, usually an assigned risk exception. Reinsurance, now this reinsurance. It is a recognized fact that most companies from time to time will take an occasional facultative reinsurance. And if the company is not acting as a so-called professional reinsurer and holding themselves out as a market for the general facultative casualty business, the reinsurer is perfectly willing to take that occasional loss. So, facultative company. You don't have any problem understanding that. But what about when they say agency? Most people don't really know what you're talking about when you talk about agency reinsurance. Now I'll start with an original concept, which was at one time agents had authority from their companies that when they had a large insurer who desired to have one policy, they only wanted one policy. They didn't want a dozen policies. So the agent could write one policy on his sterling company in his office. And then go to the other sterling company, of course, in his office and write reinsurance. In other words, they would take a portion of this risk because the one company on whose paper this is written won't allow him to write a risk that size. But by reinsuring it, they reduce it to manageable amounts for all companies. So the agent himself is doing this right within his agency. That is rarely done anymore. Maybe never. But during my experience, I can remember when it was still being done. The more common thing is if a company desires to expand. And one of the ways of expanding, rather than starting from scratch, which is rather expensive, is to seek out a general agent and buy his business. Well, what you do in that instance is that, oops, from this particular day on, all liability for all policies of a certain class are now our liability, even though it's on the paper of other companies. And they, in effect, will enter into an agreement with those other companies to reinsure those policies to 100%. Now, this is a very temporary thing because at the anniversary relationship, good faith relationship, doesn't mean you're never going to have differences of opinion. People who are acting in the utmost good faith sometimes come up with different conclusions. And that's why it's necessary for such things as the inspection article and arbitration article, things of that nature. So when I talk about good faith and all that stuff, why we should. But be reasonable. We're still human. Service of suit, the offset, solvency, arbitration, intermediary article, all subject to separate discussion, covered very nicely elsewhere. Participation. I already mentioned this in our format and style. The agreement is 100%, right? Until you get down to participation article. Then you say that this particular reinsurer covers for this particular percentage of the liabilities shown under this agreement. And they have no liability in common with other reinsurers. It's not joint, it's several. And they do not do it one for the other, but only for themselves. Occasionally, you will run into percent of and percent part of. I won't get into that. Only to say that be careful. I never knew anybody who did not, at one time or another, become confused. I never knew anybody. That's a pretty brilliant people. So be careful. Variations in article. Look at that per policy. What it says is that instead of each and every loss occurrence coverage, you're going to have coverage for each occurrence on a per policy basis. So that if you have two or more policies involved in the same loss occurrence, you're going to have a retention for each policy and a limit liability for each policy. However, I mentioned before that we have this so-called basket retention and can convert this to a per occurrence coverage. Now, it's a peculiarity, but in some classes of business, there are not enough markets that you can easily get large limits of liability under reinsurance contracts. So it's one of these little peculiarities that if you have, say, medical malpractice, and not all reinsurance underwriters are just eager and waiting and slavering to get participation in anything that comes along. They're very careful. But if you can convince them that you've got a good agreement here, they'll take their participation. But there aren't that many of them. So if you wanted $5 million worth of coverage, and if you went on a straight per occurrence basis, you'd have to go out there and find some underwriters to cover $5 million worth of liability. Fine. What if you said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make a $1 million cover per policy basis. So you have $750,000 excess of $250,000. And then we'll put it in basket retention. When we look at it, it's not pretty good. We'll take $200,000. Well, $200,000 would be a drop in the bucket if you were trying to get $5 million again. But $200,000 is a very substantial portion of $750,000. Maybe I should have said $250,000. You'll get burned. But in any event, you only need 3 of those fellows, and you've got it filled out. And by golly, everybody realizes what's going on, but they consider that $250,000 is their line. Notwithstanding the fact that if you have several policies involved in the same loss occurrence, and if you accumulate the retentions under each such policy to apply under the basket retention and pay the excess over $250,000 there, you have the same result as if you had it on a per occurrence coverage to start with. But you're able to throw it out. It's not pulling the wool over everybody's eyes. It's just a way of approaching things that works. You can also use this in the so-called comprehensive blanket, or whatever you wish to call it, where you're covering both property and casualty. If you have a loss that involves both property and casualty, rather than handle them separately, as is usually the case, you handle them separately, as is usually the case, but in those instances, you really want it to be one retention for the whole loss occurrence. And you say, okay, you take the property loss and net retention, casualty loss, net retention, drop it down. Drop it down to the blanket retention coverage, which is the same retention in most instances as your initial retentions under each class. And by golly, you get the coverage from the reinsurance to the balance. It gives the same result as if you had included property and casualty together, subject to one retention and one limit liability. Well, what's the difference there? If you had a medical malpractice and you wanted to go up to $5 million, you'd have to take those. If we're running $1 million policies, we could have 5 doctors involved. That means we're going to have 4 times the retention. So if we $1 million excess, we work on the 750 excess of 250 on the basket, that'd give you $4 million worth of coverage. I should have used $4 million to settle. You get the idea? Whereas when you're dealing with property and casualty, there's only 2 sources. So if you have 250,000 retention there, you only have to say for blanket purpose, for basket purposes, it's 250 x 250, and you cover it all. Term article. In the old days, you didn't see very many term agreements. Now, it's the thing, and catastrophe excess, and very common in high-level excess casualty. It's even becoming more common in the lower areas. Here's the basic term, Article 3. Territory article, one that is solely on the basis of occurring within, another one that's solely on the basis of losses arising out of policies written within. As mentioned, I'd rather prefer the wording that's used in the specimen here. Now, when you get down to ultimate net loss, as I mentioned, we prefer to include expense, the definition of ultimate net loss. And here's wording that we use for that. Over here, you heard me mention the modified event. Well, modified event was originally pushed by Guy Carpenter. Their first approach was cumbersome. Now it's less cumbersome and much more acceptable. This wording is a little bit outmoded. They've eliminated a lot of the restrictions on there that reinsurers demanded before they had more experience in that. And here in the exclusions, we've got incidental wording, inadvertent binding wording, assigned risks wording. And here we have premiums. I'm running a little short, folks, so I'm going to rush through some of these things that you can go over at your leisure. Here's a premium based on lost cost, 3 years. Now, when you're dealing with 3-year periods, the original concept was that 3 years should be representative of the company's normal experience. 1 year might be bad, 1 year might be good, 1 year might be average, but on the whole, we're going to average up. So we're going to handle them as compartments. This 3-year compartment, this 3-year compartment. In the hard market, underwriters said that's not good enough. We're going to require 3-year periods, and we're also going to require carry forward in case you have a situation where it isn't representative and we still have some loss. You can carry it over from one 3-year period to the next 3-year period. Well, how long that will last, I don't know. In some instances, already been eliminated, but it depends upon the circumstances of the individual cover. One thing about the 3-year period, though, is that it interjects what I call recapture. If you have the ability to recover on the basis of the experience each year, then the year that's just passed becomes a dead issue. And you may have received a small premium because experience was wonderful in year number 1, and you had the same thing in year number 2, but year number 3 just turned out to be a debacle. And you really paid through the nose, even though you got the maximum premium for that year, it's not nearly enough to make you whole. Well, with the 3-year period, these calculations become cumulative, so that in that 3rd year, you're going to calculate what the loss is for the entire 3-year period, determine a rate on it, and get that rate not only against the 3rd year, but a revised rate in the 1st and 2nd year, so they can recapture the situation from the prior years. That's why reinsurers like it, of course. Now, there are some times when you wish to refer to written premium in the agreement and use it as a premium base, where in fact it's just the same for practical purposes as earned premium. Here's a little squib you can put in there. And we've got something on IBNR here. I've just come up with the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and subsequent years, what the percentage is. I just grab those out of the year, and it's up to the underwriters to determine what they think is appropriate on that, and agree with the company. Now we have something that years ago you never would have seen in a casualty access. Reinstatement. Oh, my goodness gracious. What's a reinstatement doing in a casualty access? Well, by golly, in the upper layers, you frequently have reinstatement because they're only willing to give one limited liability, and they want you to pay more if you have more loss. So you have a situation that is essentially the same as a property monthly customer. It's calculated the same way. And one little thing. Occasionally you will see that there's a reinstatement and no additional premium. If that's the case, why bother with a reinstatement article? Just go back to your cover article, and if the city limited liability is $1 million, you write your article, say you got your jack $1 million, and also subject to an aggregate limit of liability during the agreement year of $2 million. You accomplish the same thing. Reinstatement 100% is the time. Well, if reinstatement is 100% is the time, you don't have to refer to time. And for some reason, I don't know, a lot of people just can't get this to their head. It's supposed to be 100% is the time. And if you get any election time, it's the same result. Why put in words that don't? Sometimes I wish we put in 100% of the time here. Okay, these exhibits, I'll rush through this first one, which is designed to show that you can get into trouble unless you think these things through. Here's the company. By golly, they have a pretty good handle on their business. And they think to themselves, well, our maximum exposure is $5 million on our general liability. On workers' compensation, who knows? But we don't want to pay for additional coverage on workers' compensation when we don't have, and include auto and liability, when we don't have any exposure of about $5 million for auto and liability. And so, producer, without thinking, says, no, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll say that the business covered in the first $5 million of coverage includes auto and liability and workers' compensation. But we'll say that in the second $5 million is only going to be workers' compensation. So your rate only applies to subject premium account. What happens now when you have that $5 million loss arising out of auto and GL? And the company says to themselves, boy, our judgment was pretty good. That's as bad as it can be. And it went right to the figure we figured was maximum. But they also have a $5 million loss in workers' compensation. Well, you look at the first up to $5 million, and you got a $10 million loss, and they pay off everything in excess of retention up to $5 million. Then they look at the next layer, $5 million x $5 million, and say, subject is workers' comp. You've got $5 million in workers' comp, your retention is $5 million, it's all yours, Buster. No coverage. And that is bad. How about per policy and per occurrence? You've got a layered program. So here you have an excess, first excess, 400x1 per occurrence per policy. You have a second, 500 excess of 500, same way. But your third excess is on a straight per occurrence basis. And the second and third excesses, they have the same wording that you will find in almost all instances relating to how you determine the relative net loss. And those reinsurances underlying will not be included in deductible. So, when you have a situation where you've got two policies for $1 million, you've got a total loss occurrence of $2 million out of the two policies. You look at your first excesses on a per policy basis. What, you get $400,000 in the first excess, one policy, $500,000 in the second excess. And you look at the other policy, it's the same thing. So you get a total of $800,000 on the first excess and $1 million out of the second excess. Now, the recovery under the third excess is $1 million excess of $1 million. Do you think you're going to get another $1 million? No, you're not going to. You don't have the loss to support a $1 million loss excess of $2 million because your maximum loss was $2 million. So you look down here and you say, well, what do we have? Well, what you have is $100,000 on the first policy, $100,000 on the second. You have a total ultimate net loss on that third excess of $200,000, hence no recovery. Now, that's not going to be so bad, but what would happen if you got into one of those very rare situations where it wasn't just two policies, but it's several policies? And you're going to be thinking that you have cut this in excess specified amount when in fact they don't have pictures. That's the essence of that. Gee, some of these are interesting, but are not all that important. And I just am running out of time, I'm afraid. You know, it's a peculiarity in this business that we spend more time on those peculiarities that rarely come to pass than anything else. On the things that really mean things, we've got that down, boom, boom, boom. But in the things that rarely come to pass, we have to do a lot of thinking. We spend time. And if it ever happens, we're going to be glad we did. But it usually never happens. And this is one of them. Then I have this exhibit number 5, and it shows how if you have an aggregate policy, it goes through this rigmarole of determining how much of the loss under the aggregate is going to be tossed into the bucket for the loss occurrence, and then how you're going to work the proration. It's interesting, but not worth taking the time on right now. Oh, but here's one. Yeah, this is going to be good, and it'll be the last one. I just don't have time to do these others. Here you have a situation where you have a first excess of 900x100. Expenses are included in the order of $10. And the second excess of in excess of $1 million, expenses prorated. Now, you have to read this, but you can see that down here, there are very different results. Because in this particular instance, the reinsurers of the $4 million, this is an active change. The reinsurers of the $4 million excess of $1 million said that, wait a minute, these things have to be taken in chronological order. And because the company initially felt that there's no liability, they resisted. They investigated the blue mazes out of it, and they resisted these cases. So they had over $1 million in expense. They hadn't paid anything. And then they found out, by golly, that the company was falsifying their job. They can't do that. It's going to come out. So they started selling. They settled up about $5 million each for 2 years. Well, the second excess reinsurers said, hey, the first excess covers loss and expense. These things should be taken chronologically. Therefore, the first excess is saturated as 900x1. It's saturated with expense because that's what happened first. Now, when it comes to us fellows, we have $4 million in liability, and we prorate what expenses left. And it made one big difference. It made $720,000 difference each year, just in the different approaches. So it was finally negotiated on sort of a compromise basis that was very satisfactory to the company and satisfactory to the insurance. But this does two things. First of all, it illustrates that if you don't have the same handling of expense from layer to layer in these layered agreements covering on a per occurrence basis, you're in trouble. And the second thing is that reinsurers have a tendency, unfortunately, to look at the situation after the loss in the light most favorable to their position. And if you read the agreement on that second excess, it clearly required them to pay what they eventually paid. But it took an awful lot of work to convince them that they should. I had a young lady after I gave this example come up to me and said, well, they only did what they were contractually obligated to do. I said, yes, you're right. You're right. But it just illustrates the mindset situation that I described that arises out of several different sources. In this instance, it's self-interest, and you really can't blame people for taking a reasonable approach in self-interest, just as long as it doesn't go overboard. I see I've run out of time. These other examples, I hope you will find it interesting if you have the opportunity to read through them.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Chuck, and we look forward to working with you this evening on the panel. Before we adjourn, please check messages as you go out. Please keep your questionnaires current, and I want you to remind us of something that I went to the memo and my word is forgotten where it was.
Check report tomorrow.
What?
Is it going to be 1 p.m. or 11 a.m.?
Check out. Yeah, thank you. checkout time is supposed to be 11 or 12, and the hotel said, as long as you get out by 1, no problem. Thank you, man. I hope no one leaves early. If you have to leave early, people have to do things. Please leave your questionnaire back there. That's very important.
Yeah, you can go ahead and speak.
Okay. Having thus spoken, I shall remain silent for the next 20 seconds.
At which time you will tell where you are. That's close enough. Come on, you're wasting my film. Lyndhurst. And now Chuck is walking up. Isn't that a fabulous place? We're waiting now to go on tour, so this is the beginning. Carriage and stable. This looks like it's just been renovated. This is over on the right. Where I shot before.
There was who previously had designed very square, symmetrical buildings in the federal style. But he wanted to design a building that would take advantage of nature and the rolling hills of Westchester County, the Hudson River Valley. And so he was an acquaintance of a man by the name of Paulding, William Paulding, who had been a major general in the War of 1812 and served 2 terms as mayor of the city of New York. Well, he had come from Westchester County, and he wanted to have a summer home or a retirement home built for him. And he and Davis got together, and the result was that Davis designed the home for the Pauldings. Well, the first home that Davis designed was considerably smaller than what you're looking at now. For example, the porte cochere that you see there was added at a later time. On the southern end, that is this end down here, the house looks pretty much now as it did then. There was a porch or a veranda. It didn't wrap around as completely as it does now, because what is now, I should say, the enclosed vestibule was then an open sort of porte cochere, and carriages would come. In the northern end, this end, the house extended only as far as the smaller of the 2 towers. You see there's a 3-story tower, and then behind it there's a 5-story tower. Mm-hmm. The house ended at the 3-story tower. Well, the Pauldings lived here until 1865. General Paulding had died. His bachelor son really didn't want to sold to a family by the name of Merritt. George Merritt had been in the dry goods business. He had sold textiles during the Civil War. He had a considerable amount of money. He had also, and this is quite important, he had designed a special spring for railroad cars. He not only designed it, but he patented it. And so at a time in the railroad industry, his wife and family liked the house and property, but they felt that a 14-room house was kind of small and constraining. And he really wanted something larger. Well, A.J. Davis is still alive and he's still working. And Davis had always felt that this house needed to be expanded to be a complete, a whole. And he'd even drawn up plans along those lines. Well, he and Merritt were acquainted. And again, the upshot was that Davis did design the tall tower and the rooms up here at the north.
And the date of that edition
was 1865 to 1867.
Just out of Lyndhurst, what a tour. And that's the Tappan Zee Bridge, taken from Lyndhurst. Well, there is a little squirrel there. Somewhere. Anyway, this is down the carriage house. Stables. How's that for horses and going after our car? This is the stables. We have lovely carriages in there. And there's Chuck waiting for him.
The widest part of the Hudson River. This is called the Tappan Zee section. It's 3 miles across. Tappan Zee is after the Dutch, and the Tappan Zee Bridge is just up the road about a mile. I'm sure you may all be familiar with it. Certainly the local people. That's the main thruway going up to New York State. We say we have a living collection here, folks. The wisteria vine, right in front of the house, that was planted by Washington. It was in 1842 thereabouts. It still is alive and beautiful today as it ever has been. Its full bloom is about past for 2 months, but you'll still see a blossom hanging on there. Very picturesque purple flower. And we said we had the cove, the inlet. That lasted until the railroad came through, 1849. Now, he fought that railroad as hard as any of the landowners would along the world. He was a great innovator, a great grabber on of new ideas and incorporating them. For instance, once the railroad went in, as hard as he fought it, he was one of its best customers. You may recall from the slides, he had good friends in Baltimore, John Pendleton Kennedy and his wife Elizabeth. He would visit them on that railroad. They would come up here. They were such good friends that you'll see their portraits hanging in the dining room. And there's lots of other new ideas and innovations. You're going to see that in the house very shortly. I request...
Oh, wait.
Help.
That would help. Okay.
Well, you see the Gothic influence here, the columns, the decoration around the windows, although it's considered Victorian, it's still Gothic in its substance.
Those little
points. Yeah, it's Gothic.
This is coming out from the servants' quarter and out from the kitchen. There's the tower. We went up there. That whole top part is a delightful building.
You can still get in the bookstore. That's the only way out.
That's the root room. Out through the gate, the enclosure of the back, and again, the back of the house. That was the little ice house. He didn't want to be seen from the street up there. He wanted to look out at the water, and he is certainly secluded. Phillipsburg Manor. Steve, Chuck. The two other people with our guide. That's William
the old mill that she was telling us about.
Originally, two kinds of gold and silver pencil lumber, which was, they were sometimes called the Dutch everyday layers in the 18th century. They are not normally brooding hens, and all of a sudden this is bringing the eggs to live chicken round up at night or something else. The sheep in the 18th century were described as miserly-looking critters. I think it's still a very apt description. They have their horns, as our bovines will as well, for protection, because they did not house the animals in the 18th century. The barn, as you'll learn, was for storage of grain, primarily. No, it is so much more natural when they're out. Now, if you'll go to the other lower door,
Now we're going to the basement. Barn. I'm recording you now.
Excuse me?
I'm recording you.
Okay, I just was going to point out the seam on the manor house. The first part of the manor house was built about 1680. It was doubled in size about 1720.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yeah.
They say, no, you're not supposed to. That's what she was referring to. Only the servants go down there in the kitchen. Well.
Shaft. That is one solid piece of white oak. It's 22.9 inches in diameter and weighs 9,000 pounds. Stretches from the steps, goes out through the wall, and is attached directly to the wheel. Okay? So when the wheel spins, it spins the shaft. Shaft moves the face gear. That's that vertical wheel with the teeth. Teeth catch into the saves of the lantern pinion, which is attached directly to the spindle, and that comes through the floor, through the center of the stone, and is right there. And different grains need different cuts. Alright? Now we're grinding corn to that. Alright, back then they would mostly ground wheat. You don't want to grind corn as fine as wheat because corn has oil and the oil will make it clump. Alright? You don't want to grind it that coarse because then your breads will fall apart, and even if they don't, you break your teeth on the chip. So you adjust your stones with this, tenoring staff. When I push this down, the spindle goes up, or the bridge tree goes up, lifting the lantern pinion, and that lifts the spindle up, something like this. Okay? Pull it back down, and your stones go right on top of each other. Alright? This little wedge is here just so you can slide it into place and it holds your stones at one constant cut. Put 1 ton of stone on that spindle, it's just going to fall right on it. Alright? Over here, there's one thing, you know, that stop. Never pull this out. Jamming up on it. Doing the eyes of the brain.
Out here was for full length.
Now, these stones that I'm sitting on. Exactly.
Barn. Where the mill is. Here's the walkway up to the water.
Hopefully no rain. Bring it in and store it up there through August until ready to replant the fields. Then bring some of it down and thresh it, not bother to winnow because the fields are not particularly, fussy about having winnowed wheat. Just grain and whatever else or seed. But then after the fields were planted, it was the thing to do was to bring a lot of it down and thresh it and spreading it out and pounding on it with the flails. You see the flails hanging here and down there. And then winnow it to get it quickly clean. And winnowing was the process of using a basket there and the breeze running through the barn. That's the reason, one of the reasons for doors on both ends. I don't know whether the flies are bothering you, but they're sure biting on my legs. Anyway, the threshing and winnowing was a process.
Up to the fence.